right, folks. Well, you could read this yourselves, of course, but I want you to, I don't know, have an experience with what I do, how I read text, how I interact with text, um, and so this is written by Zadie Smith, which is pretty crazy that I didn't write her name on there, but you know. It was published in May 2020. So that's why we're reading it today, because Zadie Smith is a wonderful writer. She's an important writer, and she's a writer who is doing right now what writers have always done, which is try to make sense of a world that doesn't necessarily make sense by itself. So she's helping us construct an understanding of this pandemic in this piece of writing, and I find it very beautiful writing. So I'm just going to read it aloud. I don't think I'm going to stop at all. I might say some things afterwards. We'll see. This will be the second time I've read it. Suffering like Mel Gibson. The misery is very precisely designed and different for each person. And if you didn't know better, you'd say the gods of comedy and tragedy had a hand in it. The single human in the city apartment thinks, I have never known such loneliness. The married human in the country place with partner and children dreams of isolation within isolation. All the artists with children who treasured isolation as the most precious thing they owned find out what it is to live without privacy and without time. The writer learns how not to write, the actor not to act, the painter how never to see her studio, and so on. The artists without children are delighted by all the free time for a time, until time itself begins to take on an accusatory look, a judgmental cast, because the fact is it is hard to fill all this time sufficiently, given the sufferings of others. And besides, now there is no clocking off ever, and no drowning of artistic anxiety in a party or conversation or frantic exercise. Married men are confronted with the infinite reality of their wives, who cannot now be exchanged, even mentally, for a strange girl walking down the street. Her face, her face, her face, your face, your face, your face. The only relief is two faces facing forwards towards the screen. New lovers for the first time wonder about love. Is it enough? Perhaps a dog should be added to this endless pas de deux. Or some other living creature. Young people hunger for the touch of strangers, of anyone. Club kids go to bed at 9. Older people, surrounded by generations of family, dream of exactly the same empty couch that is elsewhere, right now, at this very moment, the purest torture for some lucky, desperate, fortunate, lonely, selfish, enviable, self-indulgent, privileged, bereft student. Married, divorced lawyers go to war over who will work when. The children whose parents' divorces these same lawyers once arranged now move through the silent streets, being driven from one isolation to another and back again. A metaphor for the folly of human relations they are unlikely ever to forget. The night shift worker with 3 children under the age of 6 stops marking the border between days and nights or between one week and the next. There is only work. The single mother with the single child finds the role of child and adult passing fluidly around their small shared space with more ease and fluctuation than either party had ever thought possible. The widower enters a second widowhood, the pensioner an early twilight. Everybody learns the irreverence of these matters next to real suffering. Just before the global shit hit the fan, we were in a long, involved cultural conversation about privilege. We were teaching ourselves how to be more aware of the relative nature of various forms of privilege, and their dependence on intersections of class, race, gender, and so on. As clarifying as this conversation often was, it strikes me that it cannot now be applied without modification to the category of suffering. The temptation to overlay the first discourse upon the second is strong. Privilege and suffering have a lot in common. They both manifest as bubbles containing a person and distorting their vision. But it is possible to penetrate the bubble of privilege and even pop it, whereas the suffering bubble is impermeable. Language, logic, argument, rationale, and relative perspective itself are no match for it. Suffering applies itself directly to its subject and will not be shamed out of itself or eradicated by righteous argument, no matter how objectively correct that argument is. Everyone has an anecdote about privilege they like to tell, a moment when they realize they, or somebody else, were seeing through a veil of assumption and or relative ignorance. Mine is a minor, but I like it. Once upon a time, when my kids were still small, I was standing in line for a sandwich at Subway with my son strapped to my body. In front of me, two women, whom I took to be African American and South Asian, respectively, were having a conversation. Nosy as I am about other people's lives, I was listening in. To my ear, they were obviously working-class women, both with a robust sense of humor and plenty of lively opinions. They were great to listen to, and they happened to have landed on one of my favorite subjects, over which back then I frequently liked to ride my high horse, technology and children. "I couldn't believe it," the black lady said to the brown lady. "I'm walking down 8th, and here's this white lady with a kid in a buggy. Couldn't have been more than 9 months old. And here's this kid just sitting in there, and he's holding an iPad." The brown lady laughed, groaned, and rolled her eyes. "Oh my God, these people are really something." "Can you believe that shit?" asked the black lady. And it took everything I had to restrain myself and not join in this horrified assessment of the incompetent parenting of rich people, too lazy or busy to relate to their own babies, giving damaging, mind-altering technology to infants. Infants! $900, cried the brown lady with real disgust. Imagine giving something worth $900 to a baby. "These people got rent money to burn," confirmed the first lady, and together they laughed ruefully at the profligate fools of 8th Street. The profligate fool behind them hung her head in relative shame, and then laughed at herself. In my privilege, I had mistaken one kind of ethical argument for another, an especially bracing experience for me, as only a few years earlier I would not have made such a mistake. Class is a bubble formed by privilege, shaping and manipulating your conception of reality. But it can at least be brought to mind, acknowledged, comprehended, even atoned for through transformative action. By comparing your relative privilege with that of others, you may be able to modify both your world and the worlds outside of your world, if the will is there to do it. Suffering is not like that. Suffering is not relative. It is absolute. Suffering has an absolute relation to the suffering individual. It cannot be easily mediated by a third term like privilege. If it could, the CEO's daughter would never starve herself, nor the movie idol ever put a bullet in his own brain. Early on in the crisis, I read a news story concerning a young woman of only 17 who had killed herself 3 weeks into lockdown because she couldn't go out and see her friends. She was not a nurse with inadequate PPE and a long commute, arriving at a ward of terrified people, bracing herself for a long day of death. But her suffering, like all suffering, was an absolute in her own mind and applied itself to her body and mind as if uniquely shaped for her. And she could not overcome it, and so she died. Around the time that I read that news story, I was sent a meme that made me laugh out loud. A photograph of Mel Gibson in a director's chair, calmly talking to Jesus Christ himself. Jesus, also in a director's chair, was patiently listening while soaked from head to toe in blood and wearing his crown of thorns. I assume the picture is a candid shot from the making of The Passion of the Christ. The caption read, "Explaining to my friends with kids under 6 what it's been like isolating alone." As a rule of social etiquette, when confronted with a pixelated screen of a dozen people, all of them inquiring somewhat half-heartedly as to how you are, it is appropriate to make the expected, decent, and accurate claim that you are fine and privileged, lucky compared to so many others. Inconvenience, yes. Melancholy often, but not suffering. Mel Gibson, but not Christ. Even Christ, 20 feet in the air and bleeding all over himself, no doubt looked about him and wondered whether his agonies, when all was said and done, were relatively speaking, in fact, better than those of the thieves and beggars to his left and right, whose sufferings long predated their present crucifixions, and who had no hope, unlike Christ, of an improved post-cross situation. But when the bad day in your week finally arrives, and it comes to all, by which I mean that particular moment when your sufferings, as puny as they may be in the wider scheme of things, direct themselves absolutely and only to you, as if precisely designed to destroy you and only you. At that point, it might be worth allowing yourself the admission of the reality of suffering, if not for yourself exactly, then in preparation for that next painful bout of video conferencing, so that you don't roll your eyes or laugh or puke while listening to what some other person seems to think is pain. So that's the reading for today. Your next task is about 150 words of writing. What are you going to write about? What are you going to write about? Well, the first thing you can write about is anything you darn well please that has to do with this piece of writing. If something comes to you, great. Turn this off right now. Start writing. If it doesn't, well, here's some of the subjects that were brought up. Suffering. What is suffering? Do you get what she's talking about? Do you understand what she's talking about when she talks about suffering? And how if you're suffering, if you're experiencing that emotional pain, it's kind of like it's just for you. You know, it's like it's it's difficult to judge or say like, oh, well, you're wealthy, so you can't suffer, or it's this pandemic thing has touched every life somewhere. So one way you could respond to this prompt in writing is to answer this question: how has the pandemic touched my life? That's one way to do it. The other thing, which is probably really important, is how do we recover? I don't know, support each other. Can we do that in this class? Are there things that we can do for each other that will help socially? It's a social thing. And you're at a very social age. Me, I'm less social. Honestly, for spans of time during the pandemic, I was pretty okay because I got to hang out with my family all the time. Well, my kids are like 10, 6, 7, they're like that. That's the age they are. But for teenagers, oh man, if I had gone through this and had to stay home or had to shut down my social life when I was a teenager, my social life was my life when I was a teenager. Now I don't mind being alone or just hanging out with my family. It's great. So, so that's the question. Even though, we're trying to have school again, we're trying to, what does that look like? How is that going to be? Are we going to be able to get what we need if it's like, flip grids and writing and reading things that hopefully you feel are powerful? How are we going to be okay? How are we going to try to be okay? Or maybe not. Maybe, like I said, I'm the only person who's going to read what you're writing. So if you want to say, I don't actually think we're going to be okay, that's okay. That's okay. There's something that I have to walk across the room to get it. But if you're still watching, it might be worth it. I'm coming. You're right. Here's the book that this is from. And Zadie Smith says this at the very beginning. The foreword, which I won't read right now, but I do want to read you the last sentence. This is her dealing with this situation. She was in New York. She had to leave New York suddenly, go back to Britain where she's from. Now, there's nobody who was not affected by it. Talking to yourself can be useful, and writing means being overheard. So it's okay in your writing that you do to just talk to yourself a little bit. And because you're doing it in your writing, I'm going to overhear what you're saying, and that's a good thing, because I'm going to help you become a better writer. But also, I can support you in your situation as best I can, as just a more experienced adult who's been through some stuff. So, Zadie Smith.